Guess what? I finally got my GH5. I'm going to show you guys how I customize it and also a couple of problems I encountered along the way. I'm going to show you guys how I shot manually on this using a Speedbooster and using some old FD lenses using the Lens Turbo 2 Speedbooster by Zhongyi. Stay tuned near the end of this video because I'm going to actually show you a link to the custom settings file that I used for the GH5. So stick around. All that coming up next. Well, here it is, folks. Finally, I got my GH5 thanks to my awesome wife for my birthday last year. I know I'm a little late to the game. A lot of people have had this for over a year, but this is still a milestone camera, and I'm so excited to be doing 4K this year. Well, if you're like me, you really want to get to know this camera as quick as you can. And from what I've experienced with this camera, there is a lot of customization features to be had. So today I'm going to go through some of the customization features that I think are important and also what I struggled with. I spent up to 2 days customizing this camera just because of the amount of features over the Canon T6S Rebel that the GH5 actually has. But today we're also going to focus on vintage lens adapters, specifically the Zhongyi Lens Turbo 2 FD to Micro Four Thirds adapter. Here we go. I'm gonna check this out. Sorry about the background. This is just my work table that I have in my office. Looks like we unbox it here. And, oh, I'm so excited. Oh my God. Let's see what do we got here. Optional accessories, okay. That. And I know you guys have probably seen a million unboxing videos, but I've been waiting over a year, almost 2 years, for this to come out. Okay, but the upgrade, yeah, we're definitely gonna have to do the upgrade because the upgrade is what gives us the anamorphic. And here's the owner's manual. Read that later. Okay, that is power cord. Power cord for the charger, I'm guessing. Okay. There's the camera strap. GH5 on it. Probably gonna buy a new one. Should buy a second one because I'm not gonna use this. The camera now. Oh, wow. I always get excited about new cameras. I actually handheld the GH4, which is the older model, in the store. I never owned one. Wow. I mean, that feels, to me, that feels real sturdy. It's a thick cam, like it's bigger than the GH4, which is kind of nice because you can kind of hold it. And let's see. Okay, so we got our record button. Record button up top. I'm gonna have to go through the manual. Okay, so with the initial excitement of my unboxing out of the way, we're going to take a look at the GH5 customization, some of the problems I went through, some of the areas that I think are really neat technology improvements, and basically we're going to look at it from the point of view of you're a Canon user coming to Panasonic GH5. These are the options that I customize, and I hope you'll enjoy them too. So one of the first things I noticed on this was that the touchscreen is a little bit bigger than my Canon T6S for sure. It's also got a full touchscreen just like the Canon T6S, but I really enjoy the screen. It's just a lot bigger, a lot easier to navigate the menus and see the menus while you're working. So that's a nice feature. I can actually see more detail on this little screen than I could before. So if I'm out shooting and I'm running gunning, it's better. So that's one thing I like. So one of the first things I noticed on this thing, other than the touchscreen, was the massive amount of buttons. There are so many buttons on this thing. There are, there's two mode dials. Okay, one is for the 6K photo, one is for switching back and forth from movie mode and all that. And then there's custom function buttons. Like there's one up here, there's a few on the back. So if you take a look at the back of the screen, you can actually see some FN buttons there. There's a couple on this side here. There's another scroll wheel here. There's a scroll wheel on top. There's buttons over here, and most of them are customizable. So it's pretty amazing that they have all this. There's also a little joystick, which my Canon doesn't have. So when you're looking at customization features, the GH5 has a ton, and I'll get into that in a bit. So the other cool feature that I like is that you can actually save and import your settings externally to the camera using the SD card. I don't know why Canon never thought of this, because I mean, if you lose your settings, well, probably because the Canon is so much simpler that there's not a lot of settings, but if you're turning on some of those custom settings, it would be nice to be able to import those to another camera if you're doing other work. So Panasonic, that was a really good feature. I've used that extensively now. Because if I've messed up my settings or I want to re-import them and I didn't like what I did and then I forgot what I had set, you just re-import the file and you're back to what you had. So another thing that I noticed, being a photography user myself, there actually is no built-in flash now. As you can see on the top of the GH5, what they've done is they've actually taken it completely away. So you can see there. There's no flash on top, but there is a hot shoe. Okay, this little thing slides out. Okay, and what you get is a hot shoe for attaching flashes. Now I haven't tried my Canon flashes yet, but what I've read online is that they will work in a manual mode. They just won't work in TTL mode. So I'm excited to kind of try that on the photo side. I should also note that the GH5 has been labeled as not a good autofocus camera, although I haven't been able to review autofocus completely yet. I have noticed with using the adapter that I got, the Viltrox adapter, that autofocus isn't exactly where the Canon's autofocus is. Canon is a lot better, even with the Rebel T6S, which doesn't have dual pixel autofocus. The dual pixel autofocus is still the king in autofocus realm in the technology world. It does really well. So the GH5 is definitely less than that, but a full review of autofocus and my experiences with it, that'll be in a future video. So the other thing I noticed right off the bat is that the color science of the GH5 is different than the Canon. I've grown attached to the Canon color science. I think their color science is fantastic. However, with some post-production color correction, you can sort of bring out more of that saturation, more of those reds that the Canon color science tends to have. Of course, the higher end lenses that you use, better image quality, that type of thing, and then depending on the lookup tables or the LUTs that you apply after, or just manually color correcting, you can get similar results, I would say. So the takeaways from shooting with a Micro Four Thirds sensor are that you're going to be having more trouble in low light situations. A full frame sensor is going to do a lot better in general, although sensors are getting better all the time. Okay, you're gonna get less light into the sensor, so you're gonna have less depth of field on a Micro Four Thirds sensor in general. We're not talking with speed boosters, but with speed boosters you do a little better. And the third thing is when you're shooting with a Micro Four Thirds sensor, you're shooting at higher ISOs. Even though the camera scale says it's ISO 400 or it's ISO 100, it's really not. If you do the math properly compared to a full frame, the equivalent ISO settings are a lot different. So one of the reasons for this video is that I wanted to be able to use FD lenses on my Micro Four Thirds sensor. Now you think, okay, well why don't you just buy Micro Four Thirds lenses? Why are you even bothering with adapting? Well, one of the reasons is cost. You don't want to have to go out and replace all your lenses if you can. Although modern lenses, I will say, in a lot of cases are a lot better than older lenses. But older lenses still have a lot of value, and they still work for 4K work. Some of them better than others, so it's very selective. But the one thing that Micro Four Thirds has, which all the other formats don't have right now, and in terms of anamorphic adaptability. So, as you all know, anamorphics require a taking lens. And we're not going to get into too much detail about anamorphics in this particular video. If you want to see my anamorphic setup, check out my previous video, Anamorphic Shooting on a Budget, where I actually put together a whole rig and an anamorphic setup using an old ISCO Red Ultrastar anamorphic lens. So my anamorphic setup also kind of directed my choice in the GH5, but also the underlying technology of being able to shoot 4K and 4K 60 even, and also 1080p at 180 frames per second, but usable at 120. We'll talk about that more in a little bit as well. So my first time through the menu, what I like to do is I like to go into the record options and take a look and see what record settings there are. Now what you're looking at is version 2.2 of the firmware. I shot this out of order, so this is actually the 2.2 menu. So there are lots of formats here, but the important ones are the MP4 HEVC, MP4 LPCM, and the MOV file. The only real difference between the MP4 LPCM and MOV is that one is for Mac or Apple, and one is universally used. HEVC is different because it's for another codec. It's for H.265 versus H.264, which is more common. So now you can see all the frame rates and bit rates for each of the different formats within the MP4. You can shoot 1080p, UHD 4K, or even Cinema 4K modes. There are some important decisions here, as you can tell that the bit rate, the frame types, all-I versus long-op, as well as your variable frame rate modes are available. However, variable frame rate, or slow motion, is only available on certain modes. So here's how you check the firmware version of your Pansonic GH5. If your version isn't showing version 2.2, then you should go to the Panasonic website and download the latest version. The latest version is what's going to give you all the anamorphic modes, as well as the 400 megabits per second all-I modes in 4K. Here you can also read about all the other updates that have taken place with the different firmware versions. Basically, you follow the instructions that Panasonic has laid out. The firmware file gets extracted and put on a SD card to be put into the camera. More on this later. So I wasn't able to upgrade mine right away until I charged the battery completely. Panasonic only gives you one battery. But I've also since purchased these third-party batteries, which I find pretty good. Once I was able to charge the batteries, then I could go through with the firmware update. So there's a lot of recording modes. Some of the notable features are a higher bit rate, 422 color space, 10-bit versus 8-bit, long GOP versus all-I frame. You also have some HDR features with HLG modes available, as well as variable frame rate, which is slow motion. So, as of this firmware update, only 1080p in 8-bit and a lower bit rate can do variable frame rate, as well as one of the 4K modes.
So one of the other things I did is I went through the over 130 menu items just to see what everything was and where everything was, and get familiar with the menus themselves. So one of the hardest parts for me was configuring the C mode dial in order to set up the settings I wanted for each option. What I soon figured out was that the easiest way was to use like a template mode, and basically by setting your settings in manual photo mode or the video mode, and then setting those to the dial's function. So in the wrench menu icon, there's an option to set all of your current settings to one of the C dial modes. Just keep in mind that all settings that you currently have set are saved to the C mode dial. This includes even things like ISO setting or your frame rate. So if you make a mistake or you get totally confused, there's always the reset option. There's a couple different reset options. There's one for networking only, and you can also reset the number reset, which is mainly for photographs. And finally, the last thing I found useful was to actually download the advanced features manual. This explains a lot more than the basic manual does. The advanced manual is a lot more in-depth than the basic manual, and it should help you as much as it has me. I put a link to the advanced manual download in the description below. Customizing the GH5 has never really been easier. You can customize almost every function button on the camera itself. Not only that, there's two modes, record and play mode. There's less features in play mode. However, record mode is really where you're going to be customizing the most. There are so many useful features that you can assign to function buttons, and it's going to be very subjective to each person who configures them. Stay tuned later in the video for my custom settings file where you can check out which ones I've applied. So one of the most sought after features on the GH5 is the slow motion effect. Now at first I didn't know what variable frame rate meant, but in Panasonic terms, what variable frame rate is it actually captures the frame rate that you're shooting at. So when you play back the file, it will play back the file as the slow motion effect. So this confused me at first because normally what you do is you shoot at the frame rate you want to shoot at, and the file is considered at that frame rate, and you edit that in your video editor or like Premiere, for example, and you interpret the speed that you want it to be set at. The opposite is true for these files. These files are actually set at the frame rate, and they will play back in buttery smooth slow motion, just as if that's the way you intended to shoot them at. So you can do slow motion on the GH5 up to 60 frames per second in 4K. You can do up to 180 frames per second in 1080p. There's only two modes available for these, but unfortunately both are lower bit rates. And if you look in the codec settings where it says VFM available, that means variable frame rate. For more information, check the advanced manual. The GH5 also has an anamorphic mode. For those of you who don't know what anamorphics are, they are specialized lenses that allow you to stretch optically in the horizontal direction the image. The reason for this is you get more resolution onto your sensor than normal. Shooting on anamorphics tends to be fairly expensive at the moment, as the lenses are really expensive. If you want a cheap alternative, check out my previous video on anamorphic shooting on a budget. So there are a few different types of anamorphic shooting. Anamorphic open gate is actually using the entire sensor and the full pixel range of the sensor itself. So anamorphics are not your typical everyday kind of shooting. A lot of filmmakers tend to use anamorphics because they require specialized lenses and they get a certain look that you just can't get with normal glass. Because the GH5 can shoot anamorphics, and because it's such a specific topic, I'm going to be doing a future video on anamorphic shooting with the GH5. Look for that in an upcoming gear review video. So one of the most talked about features, and also lacking, according to some people, is the autofocus system of the GH5. I haven't had much time with autofocus yet, mainly because I don't have any autofocus lenses at the moment. However, I did manage to configure the AF/AE lock button as my back button focus. For those of you coming from the Canon world, you'll appreciate the back button focus because in photography, it makes a lot of sense. So if you're interested, the steps above that I'm showing in the video are how you configure the back button focus. Keep your eye out for a future video in which I'll go into more in-depth of autofocus in general, explain all the different settings, and configure the back button focus. For those of you that don't use the back button focus modes, you can just use the defaults and they should be okay. In video, it's handy to be able to limit the ISO range. So on the GH5, you can set the ISO sensitivity range for the lower end and the higher end. Also, turning on the extended ISO range gives you access to ISO 100 as your lower range. I definitely recommend turning it on. Focus peaking is good because it shows you where in fact your focus is in the image. You can either do high or low. Until I had the GH5, I never really experimented with zebras, but I find they're very handy. Zebras in real time basically show you where you're overexposing, depending on the settings you set. There's two patterns, zebra 1 or 2. You can set them at 50. I set mine at 55% and 85%. As you can see here, zebra 2 is the one I use the most because it sets it to 85%. Now, 100%, if anybody knows how to use a histogram, 100% of the histogram means that the highlights could be blown out. Most of the time I use 85% all the time on Zebra 2. However, you can use the other option if you want to switch back and forth between log modes when you're shooting in the log profile. It all depends, of course, upon how you want to preserve your highlights. So one of the customization features that I did is I turned the function 5 button into the menu button. I moved it instead of the Q menu button at FN2. This allows me to sort of similarly mimic the Canon in the fact that my menu button on my T6S was always on the left-hand side. You don't have to do this, of course, but this gives you easy access to the photo style profiles. The Q menu button is very powerful on the GH5 because it also allows you to go into all the other sub-menus pretty easily. So when I first got the GH5, I didn't have the Vlog profile to play with. There are lots of other profiles that are good. The Cinelike V and the Cinelike D are nice to play with, but I used Custom 1, and what I did is I set the contrast and sharpness down to -5. I set saturation down to 0. For me, this was a good starting point. One of the awesome features of the GH5 is that now we have double card slots. What this means is that there's more options for backing up your photos or videos on the fly. Redundancy definitely is a welcome change on the GH5. One problem that I did experience with the GH5 is that these Lexar 1000X cards seem to have a problem when they're writing to both cards at the same time. I used to be able to do it at the beginning, but now unfortunately for some reason it says that one card can't keep up or they're not the same as the other card. I have read online that not all Lexar professional cards are made equally, so this could be part of the problem. One is reading at a different speed. But generally they do work for 4K recording, 4K 60, and all-I 400 megabits per second with no issues. And finally, one of the best features on the GH5 is the built-in image stabilization. The GH5 supports IBIS, or in-body image stabilization, as well as on-sensor stabilization, or E-stabilization for video. What this essentially means is that you can use old manual lenses and get image stabilization as a bonus. If you're using Panasonic Micro Four Thirds lenses, you get the best of both worlds with the dual IS. This all makes the GH5 a great mobile tool. If you're going to be shooting manual, you will notice when you turn the camera on, it asks you what focal length you want to set. This is because IBIS is trying to determine the best settings for stabilization. It gets even trickier with converting full-frame lenses to Micro Four Thirds. But we'll save that for another video. The Zhongyi Lens Turbo 2 manual Canon FD to Micro Four Thirds adapter is fantastic. The low cost and superior image quality make this adapter highly sought after. This is a manual adapter after all, so there's no autofocus, no complex electronics to deal with. But after all, this is more than just an adapter. It's a speed booster at 0.72 times crop factor. Micro Four Thirds really is a good platform in order to adapt these old FD lenses that no longer work on digital SLR bodies. Zhongyi does have other mounts available other than the Canon FD. Now you might ask, why bother with older FD lenses? Well, the reality is that some of these older lenses are really good for 4K filmmaking. Although it is true, certain modern lenses are a lot better than lenses from the past, there are certain FD lenses that still hold their weight against 4K images today. For example, this Vivitar 35 to 70mm constant aperture 3.5 is a good example. A lot of these older lenses have good manual focusing rings, which is great for video shooting. Pairing this with the GH5 is a good idea because this manual lens doesn't have image stabilization. But with manual speed boosters, it really comes down to the image quality. And how does that measure up? Well, I'm going to let you be the judge of that. I have an example for my latest project called Frozen Niagara, which was shot with this exact setup.
So I'm going to be doing another anamorphic test with the ISCO setup that I had from my previous video, which I'll link down in the description below if you want to check that out. I'm going to do the setup with the GH5, and I'm going to test out all the 5K or 6K, it's not really 6K, it's 5K, anamorphic settings using the full settings and the full sensor. So it's going to be open gate shooting with it. I'll keep you posted on that video. It's not going to be for a little while yet. I still have to do another speed booster video. One last thing. So if you guys have been hanging around this long in the video, I appreciate it. I need the watch time. That's fantastic. I hope you guys will like, subscribe, and everything. I'm going to post a link right here on the screen. If you copy that link into your description, you guys can download the custom file that I've been using for the GH5. Hopefully you'll find it helpful. I've also customized the back button focus like we do on Canon with their custom setting. So for those of you who download it and try it, that's what's happening. You have to hit the AE lock button, and that will nail your focus. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video this week. I hope it was informative. You found something useful or some takeaways from it. I hope you enjoyed that custom file. You can check that back. If you guys are just trying to skip to the end, you're gonna have to watch part of that video. I need the watch time. I want to hear from you guys. I want to hear what projects you're working on, what setups you guys have done, whether you think this setup could be modified in which way. I want to hear your comments, opinions. Shooting manual versus shooting autofocus. Like I said, the anamorphic video I'm going to be shooting down a little bit later. Once that comes out, I really want to hear your guys' opinions on that. Shooting projector lenses is kind of a niche area, so I've learned a lot from a lot of the people on YouTube already, like Tito Feridin's. He's one of my favorites. But I'd like to hear from you guys, so don't be shy. Leave a comment down below in the description. Hit that like button and hit that subscribe button and bell notifications so you don't miss any further videos. Thanks guys, talk to you soon, bye.